A big part of Governor Whitman's administration was her tax cut policies. What was your role in that part of things?
Right. Well, as my primary job as the deputy counsel to the governor was as I was often the point person for the governor in the legislature. Now, I should say that it's very much a team approach, so I wasn't by any means the only one. But I was hired because of my experience in the legislature. And there was very little experience on the staff with the legislature. And Peter Venero himself, recognizing that, he hired me for that purpose. And so I was, my role was not just on the tax cuts, but on any significant piece of legislation was to figure out a way to get it through. Now we of course had Republican majorities in both houses, so that was helpful. That's often a double-edged sword, though.
Yes.
And in this particular case, these policies I think were popular. The governor ran on them. She made it clear that this is what she wanted to do. And I think the little bit of the surprise that happened was that the governor announced in her inaugural that she was going to accelerate the tax cuts.
Make them retroactive.
Yes,
right?
Make them retroactive. And so that was that was a bit of a surprise. And I do know that the legislative leaders were not informed of that until just before the speech. And I can't say that I was involved in that decision, but I thought it was an interesting little twist right at the beginning of the administration.
Did it make your work on the legislative side a little bit more difficult?
Well, the legislature likes to have they're very focused on process, and so sometimes when things surprise them, there's a tendency to pull back a little bit. But we did have a very there was a lot of support for these tax cuts. The governor ran on those tax cuts. Many of the legislators who had just been elected had endorsed those tax cuts. Not all of them by any means, but many of them had. And so the tax cuts in and of themselves I don't think were particularly difficult, but they were part of an overall budget strategy that had as part of that a number of different pieces of legislation that were not as easy to get done. And so we had a very difficult, I shouldn't say difficult, a very intense first 6 months. And the difficulty is that you come into you all start in this administration, the staff comes on board, many people don't really know each other. You all come into these new jobs, they're brand new. None of us ever held the positions that we were actually hired to do, and you immediately begin governing. The first day, when the governor is inaugurated and you're on staff, you are now empowered to do your job, and whether you know how to do it or not. And this is very much akin to trying to build a car as you drive it down the road. And it's fascinating, but it's incredibly challenging.
Wow. So apparently you were part of meetings that involved Steve Forbes and Larry Kudlow. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this goes back actually during the campaign time when I was on the legislative staff. The very long story short is that through a contact, I was asked to meet with Larry Kudlow, who was advising the governor on her tax cut policies. And a couple of my junior staff had been, with my approval, had been working with him to provide him data so that he could do a proper analysis. I ultimately met with Larry, and then the speaker at the time, Speaker Haitayan, did not really know that this was going on, but I do know that he was very supportive of the governor, and I did know that he was supportive of tax cuts, and so there was a meeting that was scheduled to occur at Pontefract, the governor's home in Oldwick, and at that meeting would be Larry and Steve Forbes and Chuck Haitayan and Donnie DeFrancesco, the Senate President, where she was going to seek their support for these tax cuts. Just prior to that meeting, I met with Larry and Speaker Haitayan at a little restaurant in Old Wick, and we kind of got our act together. Speaker Haitayan was very supportive of the tax cuts, and we went to the meeting. The meeting was didn't go quite as well as maybe the governor would have hoped, or in this case, the candidate would have hoped. There was a little bit of pushback. I know that Senator DeFrancesco was a little concerned about this and thought that this would be a difficult political position to take. I should just flash forward and say Senator DeFrancesco was extremely helpful in getting this done ultimately, but at the time was a little skeptical. And ultimately, my recollection is the meeting didn't go so well. Actually, I think that you asked me before what the first time was I met the governor. It was at her house at that meeting, and that it was a little uncomfortable. Did not stop the governor.
It's pretty high stakes.
As I
right?
came to understand, that's just the way she is.
Wow.
And she had done her homework. She had made her decision. She was she was looking to gain the support of the two key legislative leaders, and she was going to do it. She was not asking for permission to do this. She was informing them and telling them also that she had good reasons to do it. And that's Larry Kudlow and Steve Forbes have done an analysis and were there to provide that. But ultimately, she went out and announced it. And I know Speaker Haitayan was very supportive, as were many of the assembly candidates. There was a little bit of I was part of the campaign team in the assembly at the time, and there was a significant, there was a bit of a rift that happened in several of the campaigns where the assembly candidates who generally supported the tax cuts separated from the Senate candidates, some of whom did not. And that proved to be a little bit difficult because many of these campaigns were run jointly financed, jointly managed. And so that was difficult. But by the time we got to governing and got to the point of the governor being inaugurated, most of that had started to fall in line.
Just what were some of politically, it seems as if this would be a big win. Tax cut. Mm-hmm. What were the concerns that it would just not be doable? Is that what? I
think the biggest concern really was the one that formed the basis of the greatest criticism coming from Governor Florio and some others, and that is that once you remove these revenues, then you don't have. Then what are you going to cut? See, that was always the political debate. Well, if you want to cut taxes, then what are you going to cut programmatically? And since most of the Governor Florio's tax increases were passed in order to generate new, what in effect were state aid programs, the new state school funding program, the QEA, and also to fund a homestead rebate program, that if you're going to cut the tax revenues that supported those, then okay, does that mean you're going to then cut the state aid? And Governor Whitman's view was that tax cuts done properly would stimulate economic growth, and that it was not a question of simply subtracting from the state aid programs in order to support tax cuts, but that they would in fact enhance economic activity. And I think I think she was proven correct. Now, whether the tax cuts were the primary reason for that, or whether there were other things going on in the economy, but the point is that ultimately the economic activity of the state grew fairly dramatically during her time in office, and we were able to support the tax cuts by growing out of our problem.